Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're taking a look at possibly one of my favourite deals that I've ever found. This is a 12-core 24-thread Ryzen 9 5900X gaming PC that I found for just £350, roughly $469. Where did I get this? Well, Cash Converters, of course. Now I think with Cash Converters, CEX, some eBay sellers, you can get good deals on PCs if the other specifications aren't appreciated. And what I mean by that is that things can often be priced on the CPU and graphics card that you might find inside these PCs, but sometimes the fact that they've got a high-end motherboard or a really good power supply or a once super expensive case can go unnoticed. And of course that can lead to some pretty decent bargains. So what did my 350 Great British pounds pence get me today with this Ryzen 5900X rig? Well, let's open it up, take a look inside and see what lurks within. We'll then be testing out a few games because I think there's one particular factor that's going to be the limitation. No spoilers, but graphics card. So, excuse me. So, let's get into it and take a look. Now it was the pictures that drew me to this machine because I could get a good look at the internal components, but we'll start with the case. I think this is a Corsair Carbide 275R. Just at first glance, I like this case, you know, just sleek finish at the front with a little Corsair logo at the bottom, exactly my sort of style. We've got a glass side panel as well here. A few marks and scratches, but this is to be expected from a used system that's probably a good few years old now. Around the back, and the Republic of Gamers logo on the motherboard IO shield is always a good sign. We've also got a 120mm Corsair fan here, a graphics card which is also a bonus, and at the bottom we can see that the power supply is a Corsair RM850X, so a pretty decent unit. Judging by the label, I think it's been installed upside down, not the wrong way round, but you know, the little circle should be at the bottom, so I think they've installed it with the fan pointing upwards, which, I don't know, it's not a bad thing, but considering there's a dust filter at the bottom of the case, you're probably going to want to install your PSU with the fan facing downwards, but I'll confirm my suspicions a little later on. Here's the price tag of this old beast, £349.99 with the Ryzen 5900X. I've covered up the rest of the specs for now. I like to keep things as a bit of a surprise. This is a 12-core CPU that I think cost about $549 when it launched in 2020 and just over £500 here in the UK back then. Now you may be able to see the internal components through the side panel here. We've got the Republic of Gamers motherboard. This is going to be a socket AM4 board. We've also got liquid cooling and a GTX graphics card, but which one? This is actually in pretty good condition. No marks or scratches on the glass at all. Really cool that we've got a liquid cooler, which I saw in the photos. So I thought, yeah, you know, I'm not a big fan of liquid cooling, to be honest, but it's a nice inclusion here and probably appropriate for the 5900X. So let's get this side panel open and reveal all. I'll speed this up a little bit because watching me just unscrew 4 thumb screws for the next 30 seconds is probably going to be a little tedious. So let's lift this side panel up and reveal the components within. Pretty clean actually, just a few sort of patches of dust. The fans are a bit dusty, but everything else is in pretty good condition. This is actually a Strix X570 gaming board, a pretty decent AM4 board, perfect for the 5900X, which of course is liquid cooled, and this is actually recommended by AMD. We've got 4 RAM slots and all 4 have been occupied with 32 gigs of DDR4. We'll check out the speeds momentarily. We've got a screw sticking out of one of the fans here, not quite screwed in all the way, but nothing's fallen off yet, which is good. But let's take a closer look at some of the internals. Can we tighten that up? No, not really, it's just jammed there for whatever reason. Yeah, so just a little bit of dust here and there on the fans, which is to be expected, to be honest. I have seen a lot worse, and you have probably seen a lot worse on this channel as well. All the connectors are plugged in. You'll be surprised at the amount of pieces I've bought where a connector may be hanging off or a few motherboard screws may be missing. Can happen in transit. Now we have a GTX 1080. Shame it's not a 1080 Ti, but we can't have it all. This is an 8 gig card. This has been plugged in with a single PCIe connector. Now I'd recommend actually using 2 separate connectors, which the 850X PSU does have, as you can see here. It's just more peace of mind for me to plug in 2 separate connectors rather than do the old daisy chain method, but I don't think it's going to be a problem with the 1080, but that would just be my recommendation. The other power supply cable is sitting here as if it perhaps was plugged in at one point, so maybe this had a more powerful graphics card and then someone's put the 1080 in it to sell it on to cache converters. That could be one theory, because it's quite the mismatch, a 1080 and a 5900X. The CPU can certainly handle a lot more. I also noticed that there's a clip missing from the PCI Express slot. I don't think this is snapped off, and it wasn't anywhere in the case, so it hasn't been damaged during transit. You'd be surprised actually at how many PCs I've seen with this little clip missing here. We can buy a replacement one, so that's not really a big deal. Yeah, it's just the clip that sort of holds the graphics card in place. When you push it into the PCIe slot, it will push down and click. So here we're just relying on the screws to hold the GPU in place. This is an FTW EVGA ACX 3.0 version, so a pretty decent 1080. 8 gigs of GDDR5, I think 2017 this dates back to, but should still be pretty capable. Now, one thing I also noticed was this little heatsink here. There should be a bigger heatsink covering this area based on what I've seen from the motherboard images on the ASUS site. I thought something looked a little bit off, and I think there's a fan missing here too. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, because I have a little surprise for you, but yeah, let's check out the RAM here. So this should be 32 gigs of DDR4, and up until this point I wasn't sure the speed. Now officially the 5900X supports 3200 MHz DDR4, but you can use faster. It seems as though we've got 2400 MHz DDR4 here, so quite slow as far as DDR4 goes, but should still be pretty decent in pairing with our Ryzen chip, and we may be able to tune this a little bit in the BIOS settings. It's always worth checking that all the modules match, which they do, so that's good. Yeah, and what I was talking about earlier regarding the power supply being installed upside down, there is a dust filter on the bottom of the case, so you know you're going to want to install your PSU pointing downwards. As you can see, the dust filter at the bottom's pretty clean because no dust has been sucked up into the PSU fan. We just met with the top of the power supply here. I'd install it the other way up, but it's not the end of the world. Now with the graphics card out of the system, you can see what I mean by the PCIe slot. It's as if at some point someone's just pulled the graphics card out and it's taken the clip with it. There's also a fan missing here, which did look to be the case at first glance, and I think there should be an entire sort of heatsink covering this area, going from sort of where the RAM slots are to the lower PCIe slot. I'll put a picture up on the screen here. There should certainly be a fan there, and we can see that it's missing. But do you know that surprise I was talking to you about earlier? Well, surprise, this was found in the case rattling around. It just must have fallen out during transit or got ripped out. There was a lot of bubble wrap inside this system as well, so it could have pulled it out. It could have been me as I lifted it out of the PC. This just pushes back in place, so yeah, I don't think it'll be a problem, but it would be nice to see if I can find that heatsink that goes over this entire thing. At least we've still got this heatsink that the fan is attached to in place. I'll have to see if I can get a replacement PCI Express clip too, because it's not broken, it's just come off and disappeared somewhere. Could still be in the case, who knows. Cable management is also pretty on point here. I noticed there wasn't an M.2 SSD. Here we have the RM850X, and around the back we can also see that the builder of this system has gone for a more traditional SATA hard drive. This is a Samsung 1TB SSD. I plugged this in after recording this and it's at 86% health, so it's okay, it's still going. It had a lot of hours on it, and there was a fresh install of Windows 11 as well, or Windows 11 had been reset, presumably by cache converters themselves, so ready to go straight out of the box. Yeah, this is a really good looking graphics card. I really do miss EVGA graphics cards, especially this one. It looks like it's sort of got a set of armour across the front here. The style of this card is really cool. This was back from the days when you could have obviously SLI these as well, so two 1080s running in a system. It was a little bit pointless then, and it's certainly completely pointless now, but it's probably still quite fun to mess around with, as you can play a few older games with SLI enabled and boost your frame rates. But again, probably not something that's ideal for a gaming setup in 2025, but maybe we'll get another one of these and do that just to see how certain games perform. Now I'm not one for RGB really, but turning this on, and it's quite subtle. I do like the lighting around the heatsink for the liquid cooler, as well as the Strix logo at the back there, and of course the light from the EVGA 1080. I've never been a huge fan of liquid cooling. I just think it's a lot of faffing around. I think you can get air coolers that are going to be capable of cooling the 5900X. I might even try like a really cheap 15 quid one. But yeah, for the money, honestly, I think this is a really good deal. Of course, we've got a little way to go in terms of maxing out this PC's GPU power. The 1080 is the limiting factor here, and I can tell you that without a shadow of a doubt. There is a lot more that we can do in terms of a pairing here. An RTX card with the 5900X would be a good bet. Now firing it up, and I noticed that the RAM is actually sitting at 2133 MHz, probably because I removed the modules earlier on. We actually have a couple of DOCP profiles we can choose from here, 2400 MHz, which is the rated speed, or 2667, so a slight overclock here. And I decided to settle for this. It'll probably help out a little bit in games, although the GPU is the main bottleneck anyway, so maybe not that noticeable. Speaking of which, here is how the system sounds under low. This was when running Cyberpunk 2077. Most of the noise is coming from the liquid cooler. So I'm really happy with this system. Obviously the 1080 could do with an upgrade, but we could sell this on. So that's always a good thing with buying second-hand PCs, especially if you've got a decent graphics card or a once decent graphics card in there anyway and you want to upgrade. You can just sell it and save some money on that newer GPU. But a 1080 is still going to be pretty decent in 2025 if a game doesn't require ray tracing on a hardware level out of the box. But speaking of which, let's see how this combo actually handles itself in 2025 in a handful of my favourite games. Now I've really been getting into Battlefield 2042 again lately. It was on sale not long ago. I paid like £2.49 here in the UK. So just a few dollars in the US. I'm not sure how much it was there, probably less than a fiver. But yeah, it's not my favourite Battlefield game, to say the least, but I have been having a lot of fun with it recently. I'm not too terrible at it either. I don't get wiped out every 3 seconds like when I'm playing CS2. I do suck quite badly with a sniper, as you're probably going to see from this footage, but I'm getting a bit of practice in, before Battlefield 6 comes out, and I can be equally as terrible there too. But yeah, Battlefield 2042 here, 1080p with the medium preset here for 97 frames per second, a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 49. You're going to notice throughout that the 1080 is the limiting factor, pretty much sitting at 95 to 100% utilization almost all of the time. This GPU will actually clock up to 2000 megahertz or 2 gigahertz, and you're going to see that in a few of these gameplay results. If we look at some of the other stats on screen, you can see with the liquid cooler, the CPU is getting up towards 70 degrees, nothing to worry about there. The Corsair liquid cooler is doing an absolutely fine job. The 5900X itself is consuming over 100 watts of power here, about 120 watts thereabouts. I then tested Baldur's Gate 3 because this can be quite a CPU intensive game. Here with the high preset and TAA enabled, we saw 80 frames per second with a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% low of 30. So not the smoothest of experiences, especially in and around the city here, but I've come to expect this from this one. The CPU is just hanging back at less than 40% utilization, clocking at over 4.5 gigahertz, remaining at around 70 degrees once again, with the card sitting at basically maxed out usage here, 99% here, currently clocked at 1987 megahertz. I really like this EVGA version, and under load it is very quiet too. So with Cyberpunk 2077 I chose the medium preset for the sake of the GPU, but I then went with the high crowds and textures. We can certainly use the high textures here just fine, even with the 8 gigs of VRAM on the 1080. And in terms of the crowds, well, this is more of a CPU intensive option that I found in my experience seems to sort of up the CPU usage a little bit. But with a 5900X, that's really not going to be a problem. 12 cores and 24 threads to play with here. You can see that the 1080 in this case is hitting 2000 megahertz or 2 gigahertz here. And with the medium preset, we're averaging 64 frames per second. This is without any upscaling whatsoever, so no FSR here. Of course, we can't use DLSS with this GTX card, but FSR can save the day in some situations, I'm sure. The 1% low was 43 and the 0.1% low was 36, so a few little dips and drops, but I think the GPU was mostly to blame here. The 5900X, of course, a few years old, but it was a top tier processor when it came out, so it's still a really solid option though. For the money, I've seen these go between £150 and £200 here in the UK. Well, there are going to be some better choices. I mean, if you went with a modern 7600X, a Ryzen 5 on the AM5 platform, that's probably actually going to outperform this older chip. So it's worth bearing that in mind, because you can probably buy those CPUs for a little bit less money. Counter-Strike 2 up next. Here comes the terrible gameplay. 250 frames per second with the high preset and anti-aliasing off. The 1% low was 107 and the 0.1% low was 81. For GTA 5 Enhanced, well, unfortunately we can't use any of the ray tracing options, as I'm sure you expected, but we can choose the very high preset, and we even have a little more headroom to enable a more effective form of anti-aliasing, FSR3 with native AA here. The TAA is, I don't know, it makes things look a little blurry. I mean, TAA generally does that, but it can look quite bad, especially in GTA 5, even with the sharpness slider turned all the way up. So if you can use FSR3, which will take its toll on performance a little more, then I'd certainly recommend it, and here we have the headroom to do so. So with TAA, you're going to get a bit more performance from this. Between 5 and 10 FPS is my estimate here, based on my experience with other cards, but we can choose FSR3 with the native AA option and still retain over 60 FPS pretty much all of the time. Helldivers 2 with the high preset next, and the high textures. Now when I set the high preset, the textures actually remained at whatever I had it set to before, so I think Ultra, but I turned them down a little bit. I think we could have got away with Ultra textures just fine, but we're seeing 62 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 50. So as always in Helldivers 2, a really consistent experience here. As you can see once again, the 5900X isn't doing much, and it's the card that's maxed out. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, honestly one of my favourite games to come out in 2025. With the medium preset here in SMAA2TX, we're seeing 73 frames per second. We did see just above 60 frames per second with the high preset, but there will be some dips and drops to the low and mid 50s, high 40s on occasion. So I think the medium preset is the best bet here for a consistent plus 60 FPS. We saw 73, and those percentile figures indicate that this was a pretty solid and smooth experience too, even when I started fights with guards. Let's finalise with Red Dead Redemption 2 then. Now this can be a little demanding in more CPU intensive areas like towns and cities. Valentine and Saint Denis come to mind, but we've got nothing to worry about with the 5900X. Again, of course it is the 1080 holding us back, but it is still pretty capable if you manage your expectations, and here I'm using the ultra textures with everything else set to medium, TAA set to medium, and the grass and geometry sliders set to max for an average of 69. Nice. The 1% low was 55 and the 0.1% low was 52, so really solid throughout. But overall, this 5900X gaming PC, this Cash's machine, I think I got a pretty good deal here. I'm really tempted to keep this machine as my personal test setup. The 5900X will be great for testing a lot of graphics cards. Really tempting, and that seems to be a problem I have. I buy things and then I just can't bring myself to sell them on. A bit of a hoarder in that regard when it comes to PC components. So I buy these things, I think, oh, there's probably a little bit of profit there if I sell a few things on individually. And then I think, well, actually, you know what? This is a pretty good rig. I mean, I have a 12700F at the moment, and it would be interesting to see how those two compare, the 5900X and 12700F. I feel a few comparisons coming on. But as for this one, well, I hope you've enjoyed this look at, well, what seems to be the cheapest 5900X PC I could find anywhere, and a PC that I feel is a pretty good deal. If you're thinking about buying one of these old Ryzens in 2025, then this is still going to be pretty capable, but consider your options at this price point. You know, look at a few TechSpot reviews, Tech Power Up reviews of recent CPUs, because they'll probably have the 5900X as part of the comparison charts as well, and then you can see how it stacks up compared to other offerings. As I said, I think the 7600 AM5 Ryzen 5 is going to be better than this for probably less money, and then you're on a brand new platform too. So a couple of things to consider, but thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already and you want to, of course, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.